If you believe no contact works because an avoidant suddenly has an emotional breakthrough, realizes they made a terrible mistake, and rushes back overflowing with love and regret, then you may be misunderstanding how this process usually unfolds. In most cases, that is not what happens. The real transformation is often far more subtle. It unfolds quietly, gradually, and almost invisibly. An avoidant rarely reaches out simply because you disappeared. More often, they reconnect because something begins shifting inside them once the pressure is removed and the silence starts revealing things that conflict and emotional intensity kept hidden. That is the part many people overlook. At first, your absence may not seem to affect them much at all. In fact, it can appear as though they are doing perfectly fine. Sometimes they even experience a sense of comfort or relief. But over time, that same distance can evolve into something entirely different. The space that once felt safe can slowly become emotionally uncomfortable. And when that internal change begins, the entire dynamic starts to shift. Stay with me, because this is where most people become confused. We're going to explore the 3 powerful psychological triggers that can lead an avoidant to reach out during no contact, why their timing often feels unpredictable, why their messages tend to sound casual instead of deeply emotional, and what may actually be happening beneath their silence when it seems like nothing is happening at all. One of the biggest misunderstandings surrounding avoidant attachment is the belief that no contact is some kind of shortcut that magically transforms distance into devotion. It doesn't work that way. No contact does not suddenly turn an avoidant into someone who is emotionally available, highly expressive, secure, and ready to give you everything you hoped for. That expectation often creates disappointment because it encourages people to wait for a dramatic reunion that may never happen. What no contact actually does is remove the pressure that was keeping their defensive system activated. Avoidants generally do not respond well to emotional intensity. Pushing harder, demanding answers, over-explaining, pleading, or seeking constant reassurance rarely draws them closer. More often, it encourages them to retreat even further. What tends to affect them is something very different. Space. Quiet. The absence of pursuit. When that space lasts long enough, an unexpected shift can occur. The distance they once created to protect themselves begins to force them into contact with something they did not anticipate. The separation that initially felt relieving starts making them question what they may actually be losing. That is where the real turning point begins. Eventually, the silence stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like reality. And reality is far more difficult to avoid than conflict. The first major trigger begins right there. It is called emotional dissonance, and it is one of the least understood aspects of the no-contact experience. When communication stops, many avoidants do not immediately feel heartbreak. More often, they feel relief. That truth can be painful to hear, but it is important. When the calls stop, the texts stop, the discussions stop, and the emotional demands disappear. Their nervous system often experiences a reduction in stress. The pressure they felt is no longer present. The tension eases. As a result, people expecting immediate signs of regret often become discouraged because what they see looks like indifference. But relief and indifference are not necessarily the same thing. Many avoidants process emotional loss on a delay. The first response is relief, then comes uncertainty, and eventually comes the emotional impact they never expected. As time passes, they may begin noticing a strange emptiness. Something feels different, but they cannot immediately identify why. They assumed distance would bring clarity, certainty, and peace. Instead, they encounter something much more complicated. The silence starts challenging the narrative they created about the relationship. Perhaps they convinced themselves that you were too demanding, too emotional, too difficult, too overwhelming. But now, you are gone. You are no longer chasing them. You are no longer confirming their fears. You are no longer providing the emotional pressure they used as evidence that distance was necessary. Suddenly, the story they relied on has nothing supporting it. That creates internal conflict. This is emotional dissonance. It is the uncomfortable gap between what someone expected to feel and what they actually experience. They believed space would solve everything, yet as the days pass, complete relief never fully arrives. Instead, there is silence, then restlessness, then a subtle ache that is difficult to explain. This matters because avoidants often use distance as proof that they made the correct decision. They expect separation to validate their choice. But when distance produces uncertainty instead of peace, cracks begin forming in that certainty, very slowly, very privately. They may never discuss it openly. They may not even fully understand it themselves. Yet something inside begins shifting. Without the pressure to focus on, they are left alone with their own thoughts. And once those defenses weaken, their mind starts drifting back toward you. Not necessarily in dramatic ways. Sometimes it appears as a passing thought before sleep, a memory that surfaces during a quiet drive, a random reminder triggered by a familiar voice, place, or experience. This is why no contact can appear completely inactive on the outside, while something important is developing internally. And if you have ever wondered why they seem unaffected at first, but unsettled later, this delayed emotional response is often the reason. The emotional impact arrives after the noise disappears. Then we come to the second trigger, and in many ways, it reaches even deeper. The resurfacing of stored emotional memories. Avoidants are often skilled at disconnecting from painful emotions in the moment. During breakups, conflicts, or emotional endings, they may appear unusually composed, detached, practical, or even cold. But emotional shutdown is not the same thing as emotional processing. In many cases, it is simply postponement, and that distinction changes everything. Many avoidants do not fully experience the loss when it happens. Instead, they distance themselves from it mentally. They distract themselves. They stay occupied. They focus on work, routines, goals, or other activities. They convince themselves they have moved on. They tell themselves the separation was necessary. They reassure themselves that life is better this way. Yet emotional suppression has limits. Eventually, what has been pushed down begins finding its way back to the surface. At first, it happens in small moments. A place you once visited together, a song playing unexpectedly in the background, a familiar scent, a particular season, a quiet evening with no distractions. Without warning, memories begin returning, and suddenly, the person they believed they had left behind is present again. Not physically, but emotionally. And that is often where the deeper process truly begins. Because the loss was never fully processed in the first place, its return can feel far more intense than expected. This is one reason old memories often come back with surprising strength. An avoidant may suddenly find themselves revisiting moments they thought were long behind them, conversations they once dismissed, acts of kindness they overlooked, or the quiet ways you made them feel understood. They may begin remembering your patience, your consistency, the comfort of your presence, the way you seemed able to reach parts of them they rarely allowed anyone else to see. Without intending to, they start comparing those memories to their current reality. And sometimes that comparison hits harder than they imagined. For someone who is accustomed to keeping emotions at a distance, even a single genuine memory can carry significant weight. When many of those memories begin surfacing at once, the experience can feel overwhelming. That is when the past becomes more than a collection of old experiences. It becomes evidence. They are no longer remembering only what happened. They are remembering how they felt. And that changes everything. This is where many people misunderstand silence. They assume that because nothing is being said, nothing is being felt. But silence is not always empty. Sometimes, silence is where emotions become impossible to ignore. The mind starts returning to places it once avoided. Feelings that were pushed aside begin demanding attention. The heart starts responding to truths the ego spent months trying to outrun. And as those memories become clearer and more emotionally honest, maintaining complete detachment becomes increasingly difficult. That does not necessarily mean immediate action follows, but it often creates the internal pressure that makes reaching out feel more possible and sometimes unavoidable. Now we arrive at the third and deepest trigger. For many avoidants, this is the factor that alters the entire dynamic. It is the loss of perceived control. At their core, avoidants often feel safest when they believe they control emotional distance. They want to determine when connection happens, how much closeness exists, and when space is restored. That sense of control helps them avoid feeling vulnerable. It helps them feel protected. But something powerful occurs when you enter genuine no contact. Not as a strategy, not as a test, not as a temporary performance designed to provoke a reaction, but as a sincere decision to step back and focus on yourself. You stop participating in the role they unconsciously assigned to you. Perhaps, in their mind, you were always the one who initiated conversations, the one who repaired disagreements, the one who carried the emotional effort, the one who would eventually return no matter how much distance they created. Even if they never admitted it, they often assumed your availability would remain in the background. That expectation quietly becomes part of their emotional security. Then something changes. Your silence becomes consistent. Your absence becomes real. And suddenly the structure they relied upon begins shifting beneath them. For the first time, they are no longer completely in control of the connection. You become difficult to read, difficult to predict, emotionally unavailable in ways they did not expect. And that can feel deeply unsettling. Initially, they may assume the silence is temporary. They may believe you are simply waiting, that eventually you will return to the familiar pattern, that sooner or later, everything will resume exactly as it was before. But when weeks pass and you continue moving differently, their certainty starts weakening. That is often where curiosity begins. Curiosity becomes uncertainty, and uncertainty gradually transforms into a specific type of fear. Not necessarily panic, not necessarily dramatic heartbreak, but the fear of losing access, the fear that the connection they assumed would always remain available may no longer be waiting for them. The fear that the person who once offered understanding, warmth, acceptance, and emotional comfort may genuinely be moving on. And that realization can affect an avoidant far more deeply than they expected. Because what they are losing is not only a person, they are losing access to a familiar emotional refuge they may have depended upon more than they realized. This is why authentic no contact can change the balance of the relationship so dramatically. Without speaking a word, it communicates something important. You are no longer trapped inside the role they expected you to play. You are no longer filling every silence. You are no longer making their distance comfortable. You are no longer carrying the emotional responsibility for both people. And when they recognize that shift, it can become one of the strongest motivations for reconnecting. However, there is something crucial you need to understand. Avoidants rarely reach out in the dramatic way people imagine. They usually do not return with a lengthy declaration of feelings. They do not always arrive with complete self-awareness, perfect accountability, or a fully transformed perspective. More often, they make contact through small, low-risk gestures. A simple message, a random observation, a meme, a brief check-in, a casual question that seems insignificant on the surface. Those moments matter more than many people realize. Often they are not random at all. They are emotional temperature checks. They are trying to determine whether the connection still exists while minimizing emotional risk. They want closeness, but closeness still feels intimidating. They want reassurance, but not overwhelming intensity. They want access to the connection while still feeling they have room to retreat if necessary. That is why their messages can seem surprisingly ordinary. The simplicity does not always mean the message lacks meaning. Sometimes it means this is the safest approach they know. What feels small to you may feel enormous to them. And when someone responds immediately with pressure, demands, emotional urgency, or unresolved conflict, the safety they were searching for can disappear. That is often when they withdraw again. This is why consistency matters so much throughout no contact. Not punishment, not coldness, not attempts to teach them a lesson. Simply consistency. When your silence is calm rather than reactive, it changes how they perceive you. You stop appearing like someone desperately trying to pull them back. Instead, you appear emotionally stable, grounded, self-contained. Ironically, that can create a form of safety that many avoidants respond to. The very thing most people fear, silence, can become the thing that allows an avoidant to look back. Because now they are not expecting immediate pressure. They are not expecting guilt. They are not expecting emotional overwhelm the moment they reopen the door. They begin believing that reconnecting may not automatically trap them. And when that belief starts growing, their defenses often soften. Not instantly, not perfectly, but enough to allow genuine feelings to emerge. This is also why chasing tends to produce the opposite result. Pursuit often keeps their protective mechanisms activated. Space allows them to experience emotions that constant pursuit may have prevented them from feeling. And here is the deeper truth behind all of it. Avoidants usually do not reconnect simply because you disappeared. They reconnect because your absence stopped supporting the story they were relying on. You stopped proving that they would always have unlimited access to you. You stopped making emotional distance comfortable. You stopped allowing them to remain half-invested while still benefiting from your presence. You became less predictable, and once that happened, your absence turned into a mirror reflecting realities they could no longer avoid seeing. Your absence begins reflecting something back to them that can no longer be ignored. It forces them to face emotions that were previously hidden beneath distractions, distance, and the constant effort you were contributing to the relationship. Without your energy filling the space, they are left alone with what is actually there. And that is why no contact is never really about winning. It is about uncovering. It uncovers what they genuinely feel. It uncovers how strong you actually are. And it uncovers whether the connection had authentic depth or whether you were carrying most of the emotional weight by yourself. That truth can be difficult to face, but it is also incredibly liberating. Because silence is not only testing them, it is testing the relationship itself. And regardless of the outcome, it reveals something valuable. If they never reach out, that tells a story. If they return but only seek comfort, validation, or familiarity without demonstrating any meaningful growth, that tells a story too. Clarity and reconciliation are not always the same thing. Sometimes clarity means finally seeing the relationship as it truly existed, rather than seeing it through the lens of what you hoped it could become. There is another aspect of this process that many people fail to consider. Avoidants rarely unravel immediately. In fact, the earliest stage of no contact is often the easiest period for them. The tension has disappeared. The emotional demands have faded. The system settles. The noise quiets. Initially, that can feel like relief. But something interesting happens as time passes. The silence changes form. What first felt like space begins feeling like absence. What once felt calming begins feeling empty. What felt like freedom starts resembling loss. And this is where their old explanations begin breaking down. It becomes harder to insist that you were the problem when you are no longer present, creating any pressure at all. It becomes harder to justify the need for distance when the distance exists and yet something still feels unresolved. The narrative they once relied on starts losing its power. And when that happens, emotional reality begins pressing against the walls they built around it, from the inside. Most avoidants are not comfortable sitting with that experience. It is unfamiliar, it is vulnerable, and above all, it is honest. For someone who has spent years protecting themselves through emotional distance, honesty can feel deeply uncomfortable. As a result, the silence grows louder. The questions become harder to dismiss. The emotional cost of staying disconnected becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. That is often when they begin revisiting old memories more frequently, checking your social media, thinking about conversations they once brushed aside, wondering what you are doing, considering whether they should send a simple message just to reopen communication. But there is something extremely important to understand here. These triggers are not techniques. They are not buttons you can press. They are not psychological hacks designed to make someone miss you. The moment you start treating no contact as a manipulation strategy, you often undermine the very thing that makes it effective. Real no contact works because it is genuine, because you truly step back, because you stop trying to control every possible outcome, because you stop holding the entire connection together through constant effort. Instead, you allow reality to reveal what is there. And reality is often far more powerful than persuasion. If they valued your presence, they eventually noticed the difference. If they relied on your support more than they admitted, they feel the gap. If they suppressed emotions instead of processing them, silence often creates the conditions for those emotions to surface. And if nothing changes at all, that provides important information too. That is why no contact is never only about whether they wake up. It is also about whether you do. It pulls you out of the cycle of pursuit and returns you to your own sense of worth. It asks a difficult but necessary question. Was this relationship truly mutual? Or were you carrying the emotional responsibility for both people? If you are currently in no contact, try not to judge everything by the first few days or weeks. Do not assume their initial relief means they never cared. Do not panic because there has been no immediate reaction. Avoidants often move through emotional experiences in delayed stages rather than dramatic bursts. What appears quiet may actually be processing. What appears cold may actually be protection. What appears stable may be far less stable beneath the surface. At the same time, do not allow their psychology to become your prison. Your purpose is not to spend months or years waiting for a tiny sign of attention. Your purpose is to reconnect with yourself, to maintain your self-respect, to remain grounded enough that reality becomes clear. If they return, you will be able to evaluate that return from a healthier place. And if they do not return, you will still have clarity. And clarity matters. Because the goal was never simply to receive a message. The goal is to stop abandoning yourself while hoping someone else finally stops abandoning their emotions. That is where the real transformation happens. Once you truly understand that, no contact becomes something much larger than silence. It becomes a reset of your energy, a reset of your standards, a reset of the way you view connection, attachment, and love. You stop forcing outcomes, you stop chasing certainty, you stop trying to manufacture what should develop naturally. And in that space, you begin seeing things far more clearly. When we look back at the 3 triggers, they are actually simple, though their impact can be profound. The first is emotional dissonance. The story they told themselves stops matching what they are experiencing. The second is the return of emotional memories. Feelings they delayed begin resurfacing because they were never truly processed. The third is the loss of perceived control. The distance becomes real, and suddenly the connection no longer feels guaranteed. When those forces begin working together, many avoidants feel an internal pull toward reconnecting. Not because they transformed overnight, not because some magical breakthrough occurred, but because their defenses softened enough for reality to reach them. And that is the key. Not fantasy, not manipulation, not instant change, just reality becoming stronger than avoidance. If they eventually contact you, pay attention to more than their words. Observe the energy behind them. Look for consistency instead of curiosity alone. Look for openness instead of convenience. Look for genuine effort rather than simple access. Because a message does not automatically mean a pattern has changed. Still, understanding these dynamics offers something more valuable than hope. It offers clarity. And clarity protects your peace. So if there is one lesson to carry forward, let it be this. Stop forcing, stop chasing, stop rushing to fill every silence. Allow the truth to reveal itself. Allow distance to expose what pressure concealed. Allow reality to speak louder than fear. Because very often, that is the moment everything begins to change. Not because someone else suddenly becomes different, but because you finally see the situation exactly as it is. And from that place, every decision becomes clearer, healthier, and far more aligned with the love and respect you deserve.